Let's start off with some of the inequalities we're seeing, even as we address what the next frontier for agriculture is. As we speak, the UN just released a report saying 2.1 million Somalis face food insecurity, right? In the AGRF room, we're talking about the next frontier for tech. We have a lot of inequalities and they keep broadening. That hasn't changed the last couple of decades. So what kind of optimism and where should we draw it, even as we get to conversations on agriculture?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, look, the issues around food insecurity are often issues to do with other problems in a country, for example, lack of good governance or insecurity, countries that have been scarred by terrorism and so on. But what we're trying to do at this conference is say, if you look at the agricultural sector as a whole, what are the things that might transform it? And although the idea of digital transformation may seem very kind of remote to the day-to-day problems people have getting access to basic foodstuffs, actually they're not. One of the things that's been very clear and obvious from this conference is that when you look at the experience of many, many countries, their ability to use technology so that they plant seeds more effectively, they irrigate more effectively, they get their produce to market more effectively, they use mechanization more effectively. These are things that are absolutely vital for the average smallholder farmer. So, you know, although there may seem to be quite a remoteness between talking about the digital revolution here and the problems that certain countries have feeding their people in a basic way, actually the two are very much linked.
Now, we're talking at a time when you've had decades of conversations on partnerships, and sustainability is a crucial point. How in this day and age do we still have countries in Africa that depend on food aid?
Yeah, it's a crazy situation. And of course, one of the things that this conference and the whole organization of the Green Revolution is trying to do is to change that situation. So Africa overall is still a large net importer of food when it should be a massive exporter. Now, there are changes happening. So if you look at here in Ghana, you know, they've increased significantly the production of basic foodstuffs. This year they won't import any of the maize that they require. There are big changes going on all over Africa today, but we've got to do more of it, and we've got to do it faster.
Right. Still on that point, because you mentioned that we are a massive importer, here's one concern that was raised. The reason why we're still importing massively is because we see maybe countries in the UK, even after what happened with the revolutionizing of the agriculture reforms, you have a lot of subsidies for UK farmers, which in turn affects their outcome and distorts global markets. So we can't export as much to markets such as yours. How can we clarify this?
Well, we've got actually for access to UK markets, there's really, you know, very low entry points as well for African producers to be able to go and export their stuff to Europe. But you know, the single most important thing that could happen for African agriculture is that this continental free trade area that Africa's now agreed to create becomes a reality. I mean, if you think that in Asia or in the main countries of the Organization of Economic Development, roughly 60% of their trade is with each other. In Africa, it's 17%. So one of the things that we're trying to do and looking at is how you get better regional trade where you're breaking down barriers. So you don't have a crazy situation where, for example, you know, Kenya is importing stuff from Mexico when it could get it from next door Tanzania, right? So these are the whole approach here is to recognize that agriculture is absolutely fundamental to the transformation of agriculture, to jobs, to livelihood, to feeding people. There are real changes going forward, but the question is, how do you deepen those changes and make sure that the lessons of the change are spread across the continent? Because one of the problems that many governments have is, you know, someone somewhere is getting it right, but they're not often accessing those examples and seeing how they can make the changes themselves.
Speaking of examples, now you're working with a few countries and within the partnership with AGRA. One point of concern is cushioning farmers who want to compete with tech and what we're talking about growing digitally. but they want to introduce things like high-yield crops and maybe fertilizer at a certain subsidy, but at no cost to them. Do your policies address that?
Well, you know, this is a tension that there always is. I mean, people want as much help as they can get, and you know, sometimes they're reluctant to pay for it in the way that they should. But I think if you take a step back and look at it for a moment, in virtually every one of the countries that's represented here today, they've now got active programs of agricultural transformation where they are getting fertilizer and seed out to their farmers, where they're trying to make sure that, for example, methods of irrigation are hugely improved, that yields get up. And then, you know, there are other things that matter. The infrastructure matters. If the farmer's producing, you know, vegetables or fruit, but hasn't got the infrastructure there to get them to market, then, you know, their business fails. So it's also about linking up agriculture with the other things that are going to impact the livelihood of the farmer.
We'd like to talk about the Malabo Declaration. I know the promise to food security has been a crucial one. 10% of the national budget's going to food security, right? But we can count on one hand how many countries have been able to do that. We'd like to know that there is at least some point of concern, making sure that if they're going to toe the line a certain way, their national agenda must be implemented as well.
Again, an absolutely fair point. I think what's happening is that the Malabo Declaration and the focus on food security is producing change, and now we need to accelerate that. But, you know, I remember, for example, when we first did international agreements around climate change and so on, at the beginning, not many people were complying. Right. Now, everyone has their climate change program. You can think they should do more or not, but, you know, everyone takes it seriously. And I think the purpose of something like the Malabo Declaration is just to force people to understand this is a big challenge. You've got an obligation to meet it, and over time, hopefully, you pull more and more countries into active participation.
So aside from research and development, we have about less than 10% of students in Africa studying agriculture in universities. So we need to know that universities themselves, the core point of Africa's livelihoods as well, is crucial, is considered in the transformation sector.
It is. I think one of the things is that agriculture traditionally in Africa, as elsewhere, has had this sort of image that it's, you know, the smallholder farmer on their own. It's linked back to traditions and history. So young people who are going to university, they're thinking, why do I want to study agriculture? But actually, agriculture today is a real center of innovation. That's why the whole purpose of this conference is around digitalization and agriculture. There is really good business to be made out of agriculture if you take the right measures, and you've got a huge focus coming from government on it. So I think one thing that has to change is the awareness of young people that agriculture is not some, you know, ancient practice that doesn't excite the young mind. On the contrary, there are enormous opportunities in it today, and this link between technology and agriculture is extraordinarily exciting, and it will be the game changer. I mean, what is interesting is when you talk to people who are engaged in, you know, agricultural transformation, their use of technology is often what is making the difference. So particularly in things to do, for example, with irrigation, is well known, but also in, for example, the farmer who's producing goods, if he uses his mobile phone and is able to know what the market price is and how he can sell his goods, you know, that mobile phone becomes a part of his business. You know, being able to know what the climate changes are going to be and the weather patterns are going to be in the future, you can now predict that. So artificial intelligence will be a big part of agriculture in the future. You know, technology transforms everything, but agriculture is going to be a particular source of it.
All right. Still on that point, let's talk about land ownership and tenure. We can't leave without speaking about that. We know in some countries in Africa, even up to 98% of the land is held by governments. Collectively in Africa, about 10% only going to the farmers. We need to understand that the governments are able to give it back or give to the farmers.
Yeah, this is, again, a very good question, and it's a complicated answer because we really do need to deal with the land registration problem. I mean, there's no country that's going from third to second world to first world that doesn't deal with these issues. it's going to be a long process. But I think, for my institute now works with about 15 different African governments, and we work very much around taking basic priority areas and helping government deliver change. We don't do a lot ourselves in land registration, but there are very capable people in the international community now who focus on this issue. And one of the things that I'm constantly urging the presidents and prime ministers and ministers I work with is to go out. There's a world of ideas today, and there's a big market in ideas. And even on something as complicated as land registration, there are solutions out there that step by step and stage by stage can take you to a better future. But ultimately land title and being able to own land, to sell it, to be able to develop it, this is, I'm afraid, absolutely an integral part of a developed economy.
There's also a concern about having all these organizations with an African face. The projects being created and the organizations around it have an African CEO, an African general manager, but the agenda behind is driven by a board that is almost non-African, for example.
Well, not in the case of Agra, to be fair, I think, but yeah, look, this is very much an African agenda. So it's important that the development is sustainable, because otherwise you'll be dealing with the problems that we're trying to unravel now in the developed world. And the opportunities for sustainable development are there. So if you take in a different area, the possibilities of off-grid solar power, they're enormous today. I don't think any country going forward in the future is going to replicate the types of systems around electricity that we had in the West going back 50, 60 years. So, no, I think the agenda it's a global agenda actually around sustainability, but it's not just got an African face on it, it's got African ideas in it too.